You'll no doubt be aware that you can run Groove Agent 4 either as a plugin inside your DAW of choice, here it's Cubase, or you can run it in standalone mode, which is what I'm doing here. If you are running it as a plugin, you're not going to see this top section, so just ignore this whilst I walk you through the user interface. First up, if we look here, whatever kit that you decide to run will display here. This will make much more sense as we progress. But for the moment, this area, as we would probably guess, is known as the kit slot selection area, and we can access a number of functions from within here. I'll get back to that as we progress. Moving along horizontally to the right, this is the kit rack area, and as you can see we can display up to 4 kits here. Whilst this guide to Groove Agent 4 runs, I will predominantly only be using one of these selected areas, running one kit, but of course we can double it up, or triple it up, or quadruple it up if we need to, meaning you can run 4 different instances of what are known as agents. You'll see what I mean as we progress. But essentially this area contains information about a particular kit that is in use. Moving over to the left once more, predominantly we're going to see this pad style area. I'm fairly certain that if you are using Groove Agent 4, that you will have a fairly clear idea that these pads here will be used to trigger individual samples, to trigger individual hits for the individual drums. Well, that's essentially what it does when we are set to the instrument mode. However, as we move forward, you'll see that we can also hold patterns, complete patterns of grooves that get triggered by these individual pads too. So as I say, you can either click on any of these individual pads to trigger an individual sample for a drum, or by moving over to the pattern option, we can fire off a particular slice of a loop. Or quite possibly a full phrase if we program Groove Agent in that way. Okay, so you can either use these as instrument pads, or if you prefer, as pattern pads. Now visually, as we can see, when we are employing these as individual hits for individual drums using the instrument view, don't be convinced that we can only use these 16 different pads for 16 different instruments, because you'll notice just above a sequence of numbers, 1 to 8, those different buttons there. Well, as you can probably guess, you'll see that we can further organise into 8 different groups. 8 different groups of 16 different pads. Consequently, as a result of this, we can have up to 128 pads, and dependent on which particular group that we call up, 1 to 8. Now, when we are using these as instrument pads as we are doing at the moment, and of course utilised to trigger individual sounds, individual drums, each and every one of these pads, regardless of which group it's in, well, every pad gets automatically mapped to a relevant MIDI note. And I suppose it goes without saying that that particular MIDI note will trigger that individual hit. So if you are using the standalone version as we are here, you can trigger any of these pads and the samples that they hold by clicking on the relevant note, either on the virtual keyboard underneath, or more likely, if you've got a controller hooked up. Now that could be a MIDI keyboard too, or it could be something like Steinberg's PD pad controller that allows you to tap any of the buttons, a hardware version of what we visually see here with all these different pads. You'll probably also notice that when we are set to instrument here, each pad contains functionality related to that particular pad and the particular sample that it holds. Not only do you see the MIDI note number that we use to trigger the sample that we spoke about a moment ago, in this particular group, Group 3, which is what calls up by default. Well, with this particular group, we range from C1 all the way up to D-sharp 2. MIDI mapped out in the traditional way. I'm sure you'll be aware, C1 pretty much always triggers a kick drum, D1 pretty much always triggers a snare, etc, etc. But we don't just see the MIDI note, we also see the actual name of the sample, and also included at the top left of each pad, we see a solo and a mute button, so we can either listen to the individual hits in isolation, or we can mute that particular one. To be honest, it's not something I use all that often, but it's there should you need it. Well, those are the pads. We'll leave it for the moment and we'll move over to the right. And here you'll see a visual display, which you might automatically assume is just a graphic of the particular kit that you've got loaded up. However, it is much more than this. You'll notice that as you work with Groove Agent 4, we can visually adapt any of the settings here within this graphic, although I prefer to call it an animated display. At its most fundamental level, simply by hitting any of these drums, clicking on it, the snare there for example, or any of the toms or the kick or whatever, will trigger that particular sample. That all said, you are only going to see this image when we are using the edit button here. You'll notice we have actually got 4 buttons: Load, Edit, Mixer, and Options. We'll come to these as we progress. By the way, I talked about the virtual keyboard a few moments ago. If you can't see it, it's probably because you've got this button deactivated. Vacillate between switching it on and off to be able to view that keyboard running horizontally underneath. Okay, now just getting back to the kit rack selection area just above. As I've already mentioned, and you can see of course, there are 4 slots available to us. In each slot you are going to see an overview of any of the kits loaded within your project, and derived from the name Groove Agent. Each of these individual slots takes on a concept that Steinberg referred to as an agent. We'll look at what they mean by agents as we progress.